So imagine you are looking at a massive, interactive global map of human development.
Oh, I love looking at those maps.
Right. And if you're like most people who track this kind of socioeconomic data, your eyes are probably going to drift upwards almost immediately.
Yeah, straight to the northern latitudes.
Exactly, looking for the usual suspects. You expect the Scandinavian countries to be leading the charge.
Norway, Sweden, Iceland.
Yeah, especially when the conversation turns to metrics like uh, gender equality and societal equity.
Naturally.
But then, as you're filtering the data, you spot this glaring anomaly.
Okay.
It's a country where the Gender Development Index hasn't just reached parity. It hasn't just, leveled the historical playing field.
Right.
It has actually surpassed parity.
Which is, I mean, that's an incredibly jarring thing to see when you first open the raw spreadsheets.
Totally.
Anyone who works in global development is deeply conditioned to see this specific metric sit below 1.0.
Because 1.0 is perfect equality.
Exactly. So a number above 1.0 implies a structural reversal of what we generally consider the global norm.
And I want you listening to hold this specific number in your mind as we start this deep dive into the source material today. The number is 1.0009.
1.009.
Yeah. That is the 2023 Gender Development Index for this specific country. And we are not talking about a massive post-industrial economic superpower here.
Not at all.
We aren't talking about some Nordic utopia flush with sovereign wealth funds and like centuries of uninterrupted institutional stability.
No, we are talking about Georgia.
Georgia.
The nation situated in the Caucasus region, right at that really complex intersection of Eastern Europe and Western Asia.
Yeah.
And just to establish the baseline for why that 1.009 figure matters so much, in 2023, well, an enormous portion of the globe is still fighting tooth and nail for fundamental basic gender equality.
Just getting girls into primary schools, honestly.
Right. Or securing basic legal rights. While that's happening globally, Georgia's women have, across aggregate metrics of health, knowledge, and living standards, slightly but undeniably overtaken men.
Which is wild. And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive.
Let's hear it.
We are going to unpack a massive stack of 2023 global and national Human Development Index data, specifically looking at the comprehensive research report on Georgia.
It's a fascinating data set.
It really is. We're going to deconstruct the numbers layer by layer and attempt to answer a central mystery. Like, how did a relatively poor post-Soviet state essentially hack the human development algorithm?
Yeah, that's the big question.
We want to figure out how a nation with a relatively modest economic footprint on the global stage engineered a development miracle that, honestly, fundamentally challenges our most ingrained assumptions.
Assumptions about the relationship between raw gross domestic product and actual lived societal progress.
Exactly. So to really grasp the magnitude of how they hack that algorithm, we first need to establish the global coordinate system.
Right, like where does Georgia actually sit on the world stage right now?
Yeah, let's lay that out. So in 2023, the World Average Human Development Index, the HDI, sits at 0.756.
And for those of you who track this stuff, you know the HDI isn't just a measure of money in the bank.
No, not at all.
It was designed specifically by the UN to pull us away from purely economic metrics like GDP.
Right, it's a composite score.
Exactly, a score between 0 and 1 that looks at 3 pillars: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
So the world average is 0.756. That places the global mean in the high human development classification.
Okay.
But Georgia, the latest data shows them surging to 0.844.
Wow. And that 0.844 score officially cements Georgia in the very high human development category.
The top tier.
Yeah. Globally, it ranks them 58th out of nearly 200 countries. They have firmly entered that top echelon.
But, looking at the historical trend lines in these sources, this wasn't always the case.
No, definitely not.
And I think this is where the story actually begins. If we look back at the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union sent shockwaves through the entire region.
Huge shockwaves.
But Georgia was hit particularly hard. I mean, we were talking about the complete severance of Soviet supply chains, hyperinflation, severe energy crises, where whole cities were completely dark.
And profound civil conflict on top of that. The economic shock was just devastating.
Right. And by the time the dust began to settle and they started stabilizing around the year 2000, their HDI was sitting at 0.705.
And that context is crucial. Because going from 0.705 in the year 2000 to 0.844 in 2023 represents a nearly 20% growth rate.
Wait, 20%?
Specifically 19.7% in their human development score over just 2 decades.
I mean, think of it like a student who went through a really tough time in middle school, right?
Okay, yeah.
But by high school, they didn't just catch up. They completely accelerated past the global average and landed straight on the honor roll.
That's a great way to look at it.
But I do have to push back a little here. In economics, we often see massive growth percentages when a country is bouncing back from rock bottom.
The dead cat bounce effect.
Exactly. It's easy to grow 20% when your baseline was artificially depressed by a decade of crisis. So is that what we are seeing here? Just a mechanical rebound to their natural state?
It's a completely valid skepticism. But the longitudinal data proves this isn't a mere rebound.
Really?
Yeah. If you trace the line graph from 2000 to 2023, it doesn't show a sudden volatile spike followed by stagnation.
Which is what a dead cat bounce would look like.
Right. Instead, it shows a steady structural transition. The architecture of the society fundamentally changed.
Meaning they didn't just recover, they evolved.
Exactly. They moved from post-Soviet survival mode to stable, high-yield human development. Every single year, they secured incremental, solid gains across all 3 pillars of the index.
Okay, so let's pry the hood open and look at that engine. Because 0.844 is just an aggregate number, you know? It's a shadow of reality. What is actually driving this growth in the daily life of an average Georgian? Let's break down those 3 pillars for 2023.
Let's start with health. The first pillar is life expectancy at birth.
Okay.
In Georgia, that currently sits at almost 75 years. 74.5 to be precise.
Which is very solid, especially for the region.
It is.
But it's the second pillar where the data absolutely leaps off the page. The education metrics.
Oh, absolutely.
A child entering the education system in Georgia today can expect nearly 17 years of schooling.
Specifically 16.8 years.
Which is crazy.
That is the defining outlier of their entire development profile. If we connect this to the bigger picture, to put that 16.8 years into perspective, we have to look at the global baseline.
Right, from the same data set.
Yeah. The world average for expected years of schooling in 2023 is roughly 13 years.
So Georgia is almost 4 full years ahead of the global average.
Yes.
That is the equivalent of an entire undergraduate university degree.
It is.
We're talking about a society where the expectation isn't just primary and secondary school. The systemic expectation pushes deep into higher education, vocational training, and university.
But we really have to ask why that is.
Yeah, where does that come from?
Sociologically, this is partly a legacy of the Soviet era, which placed a massive premium on universal education and literacy.
Right.
But unlike some post-Soviet states that saw their educational infrastructure crumble in the 90s, Georgia managed to maintain and modernize that cultural valuation of knowledge.
So they held on to the good parts of that system?
Exactly. They view education as the primary vehicle for upward mobility. And mathematically, that nearly 4-year gap is their secret weapon.
Because education cascades into everything else.
Precisely. When you have an entire population accumulating almost 17 years of formal knowledge, it creates massive compounding returns.
It improves public health outcomes.
Because educated populations make better health choices, it drives civic engagement, and eventually it forces economic modernization.
Which brings us perfectly to the third pillar, the money. Ah, yes.
Because for a long time, Georgia's economic reality didn't match its intellectual reality at all.
No, it lagged behind significantly.
They were essentially a country of highly educated people who just weren't making very much money. Their human capital was top tier, but the national wallet was thin?
Historically, yes. Their HDI ranking, which, remember, includes health and education, was consistently much higher than their raw gross national income, or GNI, per capita ranking.
But the 2023 data marks this massive crossover event.
It does.
In 2023, Georgia's GNI per capita hit $20,753.
Okay, but we need to clarify what that number means.
Good point. Before we go further, I should clarify for you listening that this is measured in 2021 Purchasing Power Parity Dollars, or PPP.
Right.
Think of PPP like a great equalizer. A raw dollar doesn't tell you much because $20,000 in Tbilisi buys you a vastly different lifestyle like housing, food, healthcare than $20,000 in New York or London.
Exactly. PPP adjusts the income to reflect the actual local cost of living.
So adjusted for local purchasing power, the average Georgian income is $20,753. And the true significance of that number is found when you compare it to the global average.
Which sits at what?
$20,327.
Oh, wow. So they finally crossed the line.
For the first time, After 2 decades of relentlessly climbing that hill, Georgia's living standards have mathematically eclipsed the global mean.
The economic reality finally caught up to the educational foundation.
Yeah,
It's the delayed dividend of that 17 years of schooling. You invest heavily in the minds of your citizens first, and the economic output eventually, inevitably follows.
it's a textbook vindication of human capital theory.
It really is.
However, any development economist will tell you that rapid economic growth, crossing that global mean so quickly, usually triggers a very predictable societal side effect.
Right, the growth penalty. I really want to dig into this because standard economic narratives tell us that when a developing nation experiences this kind of rapid 20% growth over a couple of decades, inequality usually skyrockets.
It's a very common pattern.
The pie gets bigger, sure, but all the new slices go to a concentrated elite at the top. You get a surge of oligarchs, wealth consolidation in the capital city, and the rural or vulnerable populations just get left in the dust.
The rich get much richer, and the poor stay poor.
Exactly. So is that happening in Georgia?
To answer that, we have to actually discard the standard HDI for a moment.
Why?
Because the standard HDI is just an average, and averages are notorious for hiding extreme disparities.
Ah, right. If Jeff Bezos walks into a bar, on average, everyone in the bar is a billionaire.
Exactly. So we have to look at a heavily modified metric called the IHDI.
The Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
Yes.
And the IHDI basically applies a penalty to a country's score based on how unfairly its health, education, and income are distributed across the actual population, right?
That's it. It shows us the reality on the ground, not just the macroeconomic illusion. It penalizes unequal distribution.
Okay, so what are the numbers?
So Georgia's standard HDI is
Hmm.
0.844, but when we apply the inequality penalty, their IHDI drops to 0.754.
Okay, so they do take a hit. They are losing some of their development score to inequality.
Oh, every country on Earth takes a hit.
Yeah.
But the crucial analytical lens here is looking at the overall loss percentage compared to the rest of the world.
And the global numbers are pretty grim, aren't they?
Very.
Yeah.
The world average loses roughly 22% of its total human development due to inequality.
Wow.
Think about that. Every time humanity takes a step forward, we essentially have to surrender almost a quarter of that progress because our systems are fundamentally unfair.
We are paying a massive 22% inequality tax on our global potential.
Yes. And Georgia's overall loss to inequality, it is only 10.7%.
Less than half the global average.
Less than half. It is a remarkable testament to the efficiency of their growth model.
That's incredible.
The data tells us that as Georgia expanded its economy, built new hospitals and reformed its universities over the last 20 years, they managed to bring the vast majority of their population along for the ride.
They avoided the severe societal fracturing that usually accompanies rapid post-Soviet economic transitions.
That's exactly.
I want to theorize on how they managed to keep that inequality tax so low.
Let's hear it.
Well, if you look at the region, you often see massive wealth concentration in energy sectors, like oil and gas.
True.
But Georgia doesn't have massive fossil fuel reserves to create an instant class of energy oligarchs.
They really don't.
Furthermore, their early post-Soviet reforms forced a lot of land privatization directly to rural farmers.
That's a good point.
So perhaps the lack of a centralized resource curse, combined with a broadly distributed agrarian base and that deep cultural insistence on universal education we talked about, maybe that created a structural floor that prevented extreme inequality from taking root.
That's a highly plausible read of the socioeconomic mechanics. When you lack a single, easily monopolized resource like oil, your economy just has to rely on human capital.
And human capital is inherently more distributed.
Right. You have to educate everyone to grow, which segues perfectly into the most fascinating demographic split in this entire data set.
Yes, let's get into it.
We need to talk about who specifically is driving this human capital advantage.
The elephant in the room. The hook we started with.
The GDI.
The Gender Development Index. Let's circle back to this 1.009 phenomenon.
So what does this all mean?
Yeah. A GDI over 1.0 means that female human development is quantitatively outpacing male human development. How is a developing nation in the Caucasus achieving this? Like, what are the actual mechanics driving this number?
Well, the GDI simply measures the female HDI value against the male HDI value. To understand the 1.009, we have to split the data by gender, starting with the engine we discussed earlier.
Education.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at the expected years of schooling first. Males in Georgia sit at an impressive 16.5 years.
Very respectable.
But females are at 17.1 years. Women are expecting to stay in the education system over half a year longer than men.
And it's not just an expectation, right? If we look at mean years of schooling, which measures the actual realized years of education received by people aged 25, and older males are at 12.6 years. Females are at 12.8 years.
So the women are staying in the knowledge accumulation phase of life longer.
Yes.
They're pursuing the advanced degrees. But while that education gap is significant, it's not enough on its own to push the entire aggregate index over 1.0.
No, it isn't.
There has to be something else heavily weighting the scales.
The real driver, the massive demographic anomaly here, is found in the health pillar, the life expectancy data.
This is where the numbers get really intense. The life expectancy for a male born in Georgia today is roughly 69.6 years. Let's call it 70 years.
Okay.
But for a female, it's 79.1 years. We are looking at nearly a 10-year gap in life expectancy.
It is a massive structural demographic chasm. Women in Georgia are living a full decade longer than men.
I really want to spend some time on why this is happening.
It's crucial to understand.
We know that globally, women tend to outlive men by a few years due to biological advantages and generally lower risk profiles. But a 10-year gap is not natural biology.
No, it's not.
That is sociology. That points to a severe underlying vulnerability for men in this society. Is this the classic post-Soviet male demographic crisis?
The data strongly suggests exactly that. Across many post-Soviet states, the economic collapse of the 1990s triggered a profound crisis of male identity and health.
Right.
You see a lethal combination of high behavioral risks, significantly higher rates of alcohol consumption, particularly hard spirits, and very high rates of tobacco use among men.
Combine that with the cardiovascular stress of economic instability.
Exactly. And the fact that men are disproportionately clustered in hazardous, physically demanding occupations like heavy industry, construction, or unregulated agriculture.
And you get a 69-year life expectancy.
While the female population demonstrated incredible resilience, they navigated the transition, prioritized higher education, and generally exhibit much better health-seeking behaviors.
So mathematically, when the female population is living a decade longer and simultaneously securing more years of higher education, their aggregate HDI score completely eclipses the male score.
Precisely. And this translates into a profound shrinking of traditional gender inequalities across the board.
Let's highlight that. If we look at another metric from the report, the Gender Inequality Index, or GII, which measures reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation, we see a dramatic shift.
In the year 2000, Georgia's GII was 0.425. A higher number indicates higher inequality and worse outcomes for women.
Right.
By 2023, that number had plummeted to 0.257.
Placing them at a global rank of 68 for gender inequality. The level of systemic exclusion and disadvantage faced by women has plummeted by roughly 40% in just 2 decades.
It's a huge drop.
And if you look at the empowerment submetrics like secondary education coverage, the playing field is completely flat. 98.2% of adult females have at least some secondary education compared to 98.7% of males.
It's essentially one-to-one parity.
Furthermore, if we look at political empowerment, women currently hold 19.4% of the parliamentary seats.
Now, while that still means the legislature is predominantly male, 19.4% represents a significant and growing foothold in the legislative machinery compared to previous decades.
It is an undeniable success story in human capital formation, but, and this is where I have to pause the celebration.
Here we go.
This is where we hit the most frustrating paradox in the entire data set.
The transition from human capital to economic capital.
Exactly. Look, if the women in Georgia are staying in school longer, achieving higher levels of university education, living a full decade longer, and exhibiting massive demographic resilience.
Are they actually running the economy?
Right. Because the math suggests they have built up a vastly superior reservoir of human capital. Is that reflecting in their bank accounts?
This raises an important question, and here we hit the wall. The paradox hidden deep inside the gross national income data.
Let's hear the damage.
Let's look at the GNI per capita, separated by gender. For males in Georgia, the estimated GNI per capita is $25,504.
Okay, and the females. The demographic with 17.1 years of education and a 79-year life expectancy.
The female GNI per capita is just $16,596.
Wow. That is almost a $9,000 gap. Women are making roughly 65 cents for every dollar a man makes in terms of aggregate national income.
It's a stark contrast.
We have to discuss the mechanics of this because it is baffling. How can a demographic be so incredibly far ahead in health and education, yet remain so deeply marginalized in economic output?
To understand the income gap, you really have to look at the labor force participation rate.
Okay.
The data shows that the male labor force participation rate is 69.6%.
And the women.
The female participation rate is only 53.7%.
So there is a massive 16 percentage point gap in who's actually allowed or able to participate in the formal economy.
Yes.
I want to try an analogy here to explain what's happening at a macroeconomic level.
Go for it.
Think of the Georgian economy like a massive dual-engine commercial jet or maybe a high-performance sports car.
Let's go with the sports car.
Okay, sports car. The country has spent decades meticulously building and fine-tuning the first engine, the female human capital engine. They've poured 17 years of high-grade educational fuel into it.
Right.
They've engineered it to run flawlessly for 79 years. That engine is roaring at 100% capacity. But when you look at the labor market, you realize they are keeping half of these cars parked in the garage.
The transmission gears that connect that engine to the actual wheels of the economy are missing.
Exactly.
That's a very accurate diagnosis. The human capital is generated, but the transmission mechanism into the labor market is broken. The data proves there's a massive cold spot in the employment market for women.
So what are the missing gears? Why are women with university degrees sitting on the sidelines?
It's a complex mix.
I suspect this is where traditional cultural norms violently clash with modern educational realities. You have a society that highly values educating its daughters, but still harbors deep-seated expectations that those same daughters will shoulder 100% of the unpaid caregiving burden.
Raising children, caring for elderly parents, managing the household.
Exactly.
That unpaid care burden is the primary missing gear. When a society lacks robust state-subsidized childcare infrastructure, or when cultural biases dictate that women must prioritize the domestic sphere regardless of their academic credentials, that human capital just cannot convert into economic capital.
It's physically impossible.
Furthermore, there is occupational segregation. The women who do enter the workforce are often culturally funneled into vital but structurally lower-paying sectors.
Like primary education or nursing.
Exactly, or public administration, while men dominate the higher-paying heavy industry, tech, and executive sectors.
It's a staggering inefficiency. But, as an analyst, when I look at that inefficiency, I don't just see a problem. I see the biggest economic opportunity in the entire region.
Oh, without a doubt.
Look at the raw potential here. If Georgia can figure out how to build those transmission gears, if they can implement the childcare infrastructure and policy reforms necessary to translate that 17.1 years of female education into equal economic participation, the GDP growth would be explosive.
It represents a massive coiled spring for their next era of macroeconomic development.
They wouldn't even need to spend decades or billions of dollars on new educational training programs.
The human capital is already there.
It is already built, fully educated, healthy, and ready to deploy. They just have to unlock the garage doors and let them into the formal market.
It is unequivocally their largest untapped economic resource.
Yeah.
And, this theme of efficiency, of doing more with what you have, leads us directly to another fascinating and deeply modern aspect of Georgia's development model.
Which is?
Well, we spent this entire time talking about how they treat their people. We haven't talked about how they treat the planet.
Oh, yes. This is perhaps my favorite metric in the entire UN toolkit.
It's a game changer.
So let me pose a question to you listening. Think about the highly developed countries of the world, the countries that sit at the absolute top of the very high human development tier.
The U.S., the U.K., Germany, Canada.
Right. What do they usually have in common? Aside from long life expectancies and high incomes, they usually have massive, heavy, intensely industrial carbon footprints.
Because the historical narrative of the 20th century was that human development inherently came at the expense of the earth.
Exactly. You want to be rich, you have to burn coal, clear-cut forests, and pollute rivers.
Which is exactly why development economists realized the standard HDI was incomplete for the 21st century. It didn't account for ecological cost.
So they introduced the PHDI.
The Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
The PHDI acts as the ultimate reality check. It takes the standard HDI scoreboard and essentially applies a heavy penalty to countries based on their carbon dioxide emissions and their material footprint.
Right, it looks at a wealthy nation and says, okay, you have a great standard of living, but are you actively destroying the global ecosystem to maintain it?
And usually when you apply this ecological penalty, the global rankings turn completely upside down.
They do. The richest, most developed countries plummet dozens of spots down the list because their wealth is entirely subsidized by environmental degradation.
But when you apply the PhDI to Georgia, the opposite happens.
This is amazing.
This is the jaw-dropping statistic from the source material. Georgia ranks 58th globally in the standard HDI. But when you adjust for planetary pressures, when you factor in the cost to the Earth, Georgia doesn't drop.
No, they jump up.
They jump an incredible 32 spots up the global ladder.
They leapfrog over dozens of wealthier nations, landing in the top echelon globally when adjusted for environmental impact.
And to understand the mechanism behind this green miracle, we just have to look at the carbon emissions data.
The global average for per capita CO2 emissions, the amount of carbon produced per person annually, is roughly 4.5 tons.
4.54 tons per global citizen, to be exact.
Yes. But Georgia operates on a vastly lighter ecological footprint. Their per capita CO2 emissions sit at just 3.16 tons.
That is over 30% below the global average.
It's incredibly low.
And they are doing this while maintaining a very high human development classification. We have to explain how they are pulling this off. Like, did they invent some proprietary green technology?
Not exactly. The mechanism is largely a mix of geography and historical economic shifts.
Ooh, so?
Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, much of Georgia's heavy, highly polluting industrial and manufacturing base collapsed and was simply never rebuilt.
Oh.
Their economy transitioned toward services, agriculture, and tourism sectors with inherently lower carbon intensity.
And crucially, their geography is dominated by the Caucasus Mountains and massive river systems.
Yes.
So rather than burning coal for electricity, a massive percentage of their domestic energy grid is powered by hydroelectric dams. They have an abundance of clean water power.
Precisely. They are leveraging their natural geography. But the broader theoretical implication here is that Georgia has provided a real-world proof of concept for decoupling.
Decoupling, explain that.
For decades, it was assumed that rising HDI and rising carbon emissions were permanently coupled. You couldn't have one without the other.
Great.
Georgia's data proves that you can decouple them. You can achieve excellent education, long life expectancy, and a high standard of living without operating a massive planetary pressure cooker.
They are growing efficiently, equitably, and cleanly.
Exact.
But, to be thoroughly objective, we can't just look at national averages, even if they are adjusted for inequality or planetary pressure.
No, averages still look at the middle.
We have to look at the floor. We have to look at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder to see who is truly slipping through the cracks of this development model.
Which brings us to the final major metric in our analysis today.
The MPI.
The Multidimensional Poverty Index.
Yeah.
This is a crucial diagnostic tool because it completely ignores income.
It doesn't ask how much money the household makes.
Right. Instead, it looks at the actual household level and asks, are you deprived of basic necessities? Has a child in your home died? Are your children out of school? Are you lacking basic living standards like clean water, sanitation, or electricity?
It's hunting for the most extreme, compounding forms of poverty. The last mile of deprivation where a family is simultaneously sick, uneducated, and living in substandard conditions.
Exactly.
What does the scan of Georgia's floor look like?
Based on the 2018 assessment data provided in our sources, Georgia's MPI value is an astonishingly low 0.0001.
Wait, 0.001? That is practically a rounding error. It barely registers on the mathematical scale.
It ranks them number 1 in their assessment tier.
Wow.
Now, it is absolutely vital to state that a score of 0.001 does not mean there is zero suffering in the country.
Of course not.
There are still vulnerable populations. In fact, the data shows that among the remaining multidimensional poverty that does exist, health deprivations, specifically child mortality, which contributes 34.6%, and nutrition at 12.5%, alongside school attendance issues at 17.6%, those are the primary drivers.
But at a macro-structural level, what that 0.001 means is that Georgia has practically eliminated extreme, overlapping, multidimensional poverty.
Yeah.
The kind of grinding, systemic deprivation that traps generations has been largely wiped off their map.
And when you eliminate that extreme floor of poverty, it fundamentally changes the psychology of a nation.
It allows the entire society to stop focusing on mere survival and start building upwards toward higher-order development.
Exactly.
Good, we've covered a massive amount of analytical ground today. I want to pull all of these disparate metrics together. For you listening, I want you to visualize a radar chart of global rankings. Imagine a massive pentagon on your screen representing a 5D scan of a country's global standing.
A comprehensive profile of national health.
Right. Point 1 on the radar. Gender development, the GDI. Georgia sits in the top 10% globally. Women are quantitatively outpacing men in core development metrics.
Point two, environmental sustainability, the PHDI. They jump 32 spots, placing them in the top echelon for low-carbon, high-yield living.
Point 3, overall human development. They sit firmly in the top 30% of the world.
Point four, inequality, the IHDI. They lose less than half as much of their progress to inequality as the global average.
And point 5, multidimensional poverty. Extreme compounding poverty is statistically nearing zero.
When you look at that 5D radar chart, it becomes undeniable that Georgia isn't just a story about one random lucky spike in the data.
No, it's not an economic fluke driven by a temporary commodity boom.
It is a highly balanced, incredibly efficient, and surprisingly green development model. They've managed to weave together aggressive educational expansion, health resilience, and environmental consciousness into a cohesive national trajectory.
It really is a masterclass in beyond GDP thinking. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, let's distill this massive stack of UN data into 3 ultimate takeaways.
First, we have the lesson of efficient transformation. Moving from the severe post-Soviet turbulence of the 1990s to nearly 20% HDI growth in 2 decades proves that sustained structural investment in universal human capital, even in the absence of massive natural resource wealth, works.
Second, they are a true gender pioneer. A GDI over 1.0 driven by a massive 17-year education dividend for women. But it comes with a glaring caveat.
The labor market paradox.
Right. The human capital is built. The urgent challenge for the next decade is unlocking those garage doors, fixing those transmission gears in the labor market, and closing that income gap to unleash their full economic potential.
And third, the green miracle. They have provided empirical proof that a nation can achieve top-tier, very high human development while minimizing planetary stress.
Operating over 30% below the global carbon emission average through a mix of structural economic shifts and leveraging clean geography.
It's incredibly impressive.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought that I want to turn back to you. We spend so much of our time in the daily news cycle obsessing over which country has the absolute biggest gross domestic product.
We constantly rank nations by who has the largest tech conglomerates, or the most powerful militaries, or the highest concentration of billionaires.
Our global dialogue is obsessively focused on the total volume of wealth.
We treat the sheer accumulation of capital as the sole, unquestioned metric of human success.
But what if the ultimate measure of a civilization isn't how much wealth it hoards? What if the true measure is efficiency?
I like that.
What if greatness is defined by how efficiently a society converts every single dollar it has into a year of university education for a child, an extra decade of healthy life for a grandparent, and a cleaner sky for everyone living under it?
It reframes the whole concept of development.
It does. If a relatively small country like Georgia, without the vast, lucrative oil reserves of the Middle East, without the historic, centuries-old wealth of Western Europe, and without the massive, dominating tech engines of North America, if they can engineer a human development miracle without sacrificing the planet or leaving its women behind in the classroom,
Then what is the rest of the world's excuse?
exactly. Think about how your own country's socioeconomic model measures up to this beyond GDP standard. Are you just growing the raw economy, or are you actually growing human potential? Something to think about.